proudly brought to you by the Nigerian Economic Summit Group.
We're in Nigeria, Abuja. It's the 17th Nigerian Economic Summit, and we do know a big issue in Nigeria is that of infrastructure. Government coming up with various mechanisms to fund major infrastructure. We know of the power sector reforms. We're going to be seeing some privatization of assets there. Funding will come through in that way. Sovereign Wealth Fund to direct some of the savings that Nigeria incurs from its oil revenues into very constructive infrastructure projects, many others to the fore. Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, talk to us about the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and I want to know particularly how it's going to be active in the market, because we do know that they're going to be looking to the Nigerian Stock Exchange to be investing in equities, in bonds as well. So there is the question of, is the market robust, mature enough to handle that? The lessons we can learn from an AMCON, for instance.
Well, the key thing with the Sovereign Wealth Fund, I think, as structured is that it's unique in a sense in the world. Usually, sovereign wealth funds are there to acquire assets outside your country. It's very rare. I haven't seen one where it's basically for investments locally, but it does reflect the huge infrastructure deficit and capital deficit in the country, and that we need to basically find some innovative way of channeling some of the excess savings from crude oil into the infrastructure, rather than have that go into the regular budget and just get spent on recurrent and revenue expenditure. And now the fund itself has three components. One is obviously a long-term intergenerational savings component. The other is an economic stabilization component that's basically aimed at smoothing the budgetary cycles in the event of fluctuations in commodity prices. And the third bit is the infrastructure component. Now, the estimates are that this country will need about $10 billion per annum over the next 10 years for infrastructure. And clearly 1 billion naira, or a third of $1 billion naira, is just a drop in the ocean. So a lot depends on how quickly that fund is able to leverage other funds, but also our ability to package these projects, okay, and prioritize them so that we have those that have the highest impact on the and highest multiplier effects on the economy. If you could, for instance, direct these funds towards, say, unlocking the power problem. I always say that we should try to focus on 2 or 3 things. If you try to fix all the problems of the economy, you never succeed in doing anything. If you say you want to fix power, fix power. If you want to fix road transportation infrastructure, fix a road or rail transportation infrastructure. Do one thing after the other, and then do it well. Otherwise, you end up with this pie in the sky, a dream about what you need to do, and then you don't.
Mohammed Ahmed, your views on this one, because also we're looking to you to unlock financing in critical infrastructure projects. Now, in as much as those assets do exist that you can start investing, there is also a sense that the Nigerian pension funds should be allowed to invest abroad, that the market should provide alternative investment platforms that you referred to earlier on. What would be an ideal situation for you?
Well, in terms of foreign investment, we've taken a conscious decision to be a bit cautious. We are cautious for a number of reasons. One, we're building up funds, and we needed to build confidence so that Nigerians will not feel that we're taking their money out of the country. 2, we needed to also build skills, both as institutional investors, as regulators, as to how investment instruments are managed abroad. And thirdly, our local requirements are so significant that perhaps thinking about moving out of the country at this stage maybe. And of course, where do you go, given the fact that even the foreign market rates are not that as attractive as they are. So obviously for now, we'll remain within Nigeria, even though the law provides that we can invest abroad with the approval of Mr. President. So that is basically one issue. But however, what we did in our investment regulation was to encourage, for instance, supernatural national institutions like IFC. They can raise bonds. And to that extent, they can invest, they can utilize 75% of that locally, which in the 25% can go abroad, but through an intermediary, not a kind of a direct investment. We also allow private equity, which 25% can also go abroad, but it has to be a locally incorporated PE entity, basically. So these are some of the issues we're looking at. And the focus is how do we utilize our national savings to develop our country.
I'd like you to add your voice on this one, because we've seen sovereign wealth funds work fantastically in some of the Gulf states, for instance, and the Asian states. We want it to work well for Nigeria.
I think the way it works well for Nigeria is that The structure has to be very specific. What are these sovereign wealth funds for? That's already been identified by the governor. We know how we're going to spend the sovereign wealth funds. Although we say that we have an infrastructure fund, to my mind, that's almost a generational transfer, because as you increase infrastructure, you're building the economy for the next generation. People constantly worry about inflation. If we use the funds intelligently to build infrastructure, we sort out the power problem, we sort out the transportation problems, we will find inflation in this country comes down. At that point, it's going to be a lot easier for people to raise long-term financing without needing to resort to the guarantees that we're talking about now. But at the moment, we need to use those guarantees. When one's investing as a sovereign wealth fund, one has to appreciate the fact that this is really a national savings account, and therefore it's not a charitable organization. If it's going to invest in infrastructure, it has to get a return. By getting the best minds into that sovereign wealth fund, you will have the best investment department in the country, hopefully sitting there, and from there other people can learn and as I said earlier, co-invest.
Governor, I want to come back to you because the capital markets will be one way in which infrastructure projects are funded through bonds. But there are other more direct investments that will happen. And this is where we start talking about PPPs and how you partner with the state and who incurs the risk and when does the state hand back the asset. And there is a sense that Nigeria hasn't really gotten to grips with what the regulation ought to be here. It's a very touch and go and ad hoc system at the moment. One state does one thing, another state does another thing. There's absolutely no competition. So ultimately what's happening is investors are coming through and charging threefold, fivefold the services that they would charge any other government, simply because Nigeria doesn't even have a base from which to begin.
I think a major problem obviously is skills, and it's again the nature of the manner in which the market developed. I always think, I say things like universal banking as a model was a disaster, because basically what happened is you had all these institutions that were basically retail commercial banks, okay, taking over areas that should be really taken over by capital markets. So we don't have proper project analysts, we don't have proper investment bankers, we don't have the skills to even understand, okay, how these things are structured. And as you break up that model and begin to have proper PE firms, proper investment banks come in, okay, which is what we've tried to do by breaking up the model. We get the human capital in there. That's one problem. The second problem really is not about regulation, but about politicians themselves. If you have a situation in which people don't understand that a contract for 30 years is a contract for 30 years, irrespective of which party is in power. But if you have a governor who comes in and because it was the previous governor who gave this concession, he feels he can reverse the term, or a new minister comes in and begins to open up agreements that have been signed, you're going to have people scared of coming in. Now, people need to understand that if we say this is a PPP, it's a 25, 30-year project, it doesn't matter the next governor, the next political party, the next government, they're going to respect the sanctity of that contract. I think that is the most critical element in long-term investment.
All right, I'd like to come to this side of the room, and let me start with you, Mr. Zacchaeus. The real economy of Nigeria is where we're going to see a lot of action. And we know that to a large extent we focus on the mainstream, the formal sector, but a lot happens on the informal side of the economy. And this is where we need to start seeing financing being unraveled. For SMEs, we heard in the session before, for different and innovative projects. In your mind, what is a bankable project? Where would banks need to direct their funds? Where would banks need to overlook some of the rigors in which they assess risk and those sorts of issues?
Yeah, thank you. In the first place, I want to say that, you know, there has always been this repetition about finance, finance, finance. And from a lot of discussion that we had and some studies we have seen, when you talk about the constraints of the economy, you have to, first of all, look at the power, infrastructure, security, and funding is always maybe a third place in terms of the chain of constraints. In terms of the value chain, you know, you discover that there had been talk about bailout, even if you bail out the banking industry, because or the financial system, because it's the engine of the economy. Some people look at it and say the banking have been bailed out. What about the other sectors? But we should look at it from a micro point of view. If you look at the banking sector as part of the economy, then you know that whatever is done to the banking system should be taken like a first aid to the entire economy. In other words, beyond that, the economic aspects, the underlying economy has to function. Otherwise, this bubble can always be 5 years down the road. Why are banks failing in the first place? Is because the underlying economy, there's a misalignment. So if the economy is not productive for people to be able to repay their loan, then fixing the banking or financial system alone will not help. So we have to take a look at the other aspects, the agricultural, the agric, the real sector, the manufacturing, all those things that the banking sector has to finance, because finance and banking is a service to the real economy. So we need to fix the real economy to be able to, so it's a matter of where do you draw the line. It's a vicious cycle.
You're nodding, Fola Daniels. So does that mean you concur?
I was nodding when you started with the informal sector, and I think it's an area we've hugely neglected in the country, and we really need to refocus attention on the informal sector. Taking the insurance sector as an example, I mean, we've largely concentrated attention in the formal sector. We go to town centers, cities, to look for business, but the informal sector has a lot of opportunities, and the informal sector is really, really huge. And they are not, they don't have addresses. I mean, if you look at artisans that generate quite a lot of income, that can be a source of savings. We really need to focus on them. And that is why our MDRI program is really looking at the grassroots. What can we get from the grassroots to augment what we have from the formal sector? There's a lot of opportunities there. And that is what we are saying. Microinsurance, for instance, is an area that we need to look at. The agri-insurance, here we have one company cannot sufficiently service the agricultural sector. So we really need to open up the agricultural insurance so that all other insurance companies having current license can offer service to that sector. That is the informal sector. A lot of opportunities abound there, and we really need to exploit it to our advantage.
How much risk are you prepared to take as the insurance industry, as the banks? Because we've seen almost a reticence, if that's the right word, for banks to lend, particularly post the 2009 crisis. Banks are overly cautious in just unlocking that funding. And even though the CBN set up some sort of an additional credit facility for agriculture through the banks, you don't hear much about activity in terms of funding flowing into that sector. So there's a sense that Nigerian banks have been burnt and they don't want to get themselves burnt again.
Is that for me?
That's for whoever. And you said
that should be for me. Well, let's first of all try and clarify some conceptions. Okay, if you go back prior to 2009, what were the banks lending to? The banks were lending money to stockbrokers, okay, to buy shares, and banks were lending money to SPVs that were set up to manipulate share prices. Banks were lending money to all marketers who depend on subsidies. Okay, and most of the banks that went under because the bubbles that were created in the commodities and asset price markets fell. SMEs have never been recipients of lending. Agriculture has never been a recipient of lending. So the real question is, why has there been such poor intermediation between of savings into the real economy? And there are a number of issues. There is a question of underwriting capacity in the banks themselves. But there's also the question of the failure of overall economic policy. I mean, manufacturing is 4% of GDP. That is not because of a lack of finance. It's because of the failure of power and infrastructure. Okay? And now, until you fix power, until you fix infrastructure, you're not going to get viable counterparties out there in manufacturing. Okay? Agriculture is not commercially viable. But that is because of the failure of agricultural policy. All of it is primary production. You're not going to lend to a tomato farmer if 40% or 50% of his output is going to perish. But he cannot preserve that output if he doesn't have power and cold rooms. So I think the new thing that's why it's good to have someone like Ngozi as a coordinating minister for the economy. The whole idea is to recognize that finance cannot work in a silo. Okay, you want the banks to lend, you've got to do the right things in government as well. and Ministry of Agriculture has to fix agric, water resources has to fix the dams, power has to put the power in there, and the banks can then provide the funding, and the capital market brings in the funding for the infrastructure, and that way you close the loop.
I want to bring in the stock exchange, but just before I do that, Malcolm Gilroy, bankable projects for you in Nigeria. Where would you, private equity players, foreign investors, local investors, where would they go with all these incumbent risks?
Tremendous need and a tremendous thirst for agricultural projects. The problem is that people can't lend or invest in the agricultural project unless they have the whole value chain sorted out. So it's no good just investing with the farmer if, as the governor says, 60% or 40% of the product never gets to market. Yeah. It's not even really very good just investing in the processor if they can't ship their finished good from the processor. So that, to me, is the one market that everybody is looking at. And every time I go to Europe, I get people saying to me, how can we invest in agriculture, not just in Nigeria, but in Africa, but Nigeria particularly.
Let's
and mining, which is the one that we haven't talked about.
Let's talk about the stock exchange. Remote, new listings. You've got companies here, we won't mention any names, but they generate and derive 60% of their revenues in Nigeria. Big players, but they won't come to the market.
I think Lerato is afraid to mention MTN. There are a number of issues. First, we need to make sure that we're promoting the stock exchange and focusing on the issues that give the stock exchange a unique advantage. If I was an MTN today, or a Glo, or an Airtel, I will invest. I will list on the Nigerian Stock Exchange. First, because when you look at the companies that are listed on the stock exchange, they can realize greater value than some of the companies that are listed because they're a brand that are well known. You will note that, for example, the Dangote group of companies, a lot of them have only been listed in the last 10 years. The Dangote group of companies today are able to raise not just money from Nigerians, but money from all over the world. They've been able to enhance their brand. People have more empathy with their products because they feel they can participate in the success of those companies. I would say, for example, if there are a number of the exploration and production companies in Nigeria, if they were listed on the Nigerian Stock Exchange today, a number of Nigerians will feel that they're a part of the success, and therefore when somebody's trying to blow up a pipeline, they will go and protect those pipelines. But there are also things that institutions expect a stock exchange or expect a regulator to do. And I believe in the last 22 months, we have been doing that. We do believe, for example, that corporate governance is a competitiveness tool for any economy. And as you know, in April this year, we revised the corporate governance code. And what we are told is that that code is certainly one that competes with any code that's considered a first-class code all over the world.
I'd like to thank the Honourable Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, Sanusi Lamido Sanusi. I'd also like to thank our other guests, Arun Maote, the Director General of the Securities and Exchange Commission of Nigeria, Anata Zacchaeus, who is the DG for the Nigerian Depositor Insurance Corporation, Fola Daniel, the DG of NICOM. Thanks so much to you, Mr. Mohammed K. Ahmed, the DG of PENCOM, Malcolm Gilroy, Head of Asset Management at Afrinvest, and last but not least, Oscar Nyema. Thank you so much, the CEO of the Nigerian Stock Exchange.